Hi, my name is Peter Beinart. I'm a fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace and really excited to be joined today for this episode of Occupied Thoughts by Ben Rhodes, who I'm sure most of you know. Ben is the former Deputy National Security Advisor in the Obama administration. He's also the co-host of Pod Save the World, a contributor for NBC and MSNBC, the co-chair of National Security Action, and the author of the soon-to-be-released book, After the Fall, Being American in the World We've Made. Ben, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Peter. Sorry, my bio's a little long. I gotta cut that down.
No.
But it's great to be there.
You know, you're busy. I mean, I follow a lot of stuff you do, so I can tell how busy you are. There's a ton that I would love to talk to you about, just because one of the things I find so interesting about you is that I feel like you are someone who is able to see American foreign policy both from the inside and the outside, because and it reminds me, I did this piece like a year ago about whether America intervenes in other countries' elections. It was obviously in response. And I've called all these like people who had worked in the Obama administration, and they were all like, no. I mean, sure, we've done bad things in the past, but basically like there's a pretty fundamental distinction between how we operate and how other countries operate. And then I called all these academics who work on like Latin America and other things, and they're like, are you crazy? Of course we do all that stuff, And it was for me just one of these moments where I realized these are people who had gone to the same kind of schools. They were the same demographics, but like they saw the world. And one of the things I find really fascinating about your journey is I feel like you have had this experience of both in and outside, being in government and being outside of government. And I feel like I particularly wanted to ask you about what that's like on this question of Israel. I know it's something you care a lot about, and is maybe one of those areas where there's this like really big discrepancy between kind of like official Washington discourse and the discourse you sometimes hear in other places. And I wanted to just ask you a little bit, like from your own personal experience, how is working on Israel policy when you're in the White House different than working on policy for other countries?
Yeah, well, Peter, I think, look, it's different in a lot of ways. First of all, you meet more with outside organized constituency groups on Israel than any other foreign policy issue. And I'd actually go as far to say that you probably meet, as a senior White House official working in national security, the number of people who you meet from kind of the organized pro-Israel community equals all the other meetings that you might do with kind of diaspora or constituency groups on all the other issues. It's that degree of just dwarfing, and I'm speaking about the Obama experience. I'm pretty confident that that's a consistent thread across administrations. So number one, you just have this incredibly organized pro-Israel community that is very accustomed to having access in the White House, in Congress, at the State Department. It's kind of taken as granted, as given that that's going to be the way things are done. I think secondly, the degree of congressional interest, again, dwarfs any other issue that I worked on in the Obama years. And so anything with a nexus to Israel, be it Iran or the Palestinian issue, the two dominant ones in our time, you're going to hear from members of Congress. You're going to be expected to be briefing members of Congress. If there's any daylight between the US and the Israeli government, even Democratic members of Congress are going to be upset, concerned about that. And then lastly, like the media interest is dramatically intensified. And that's both a very aggressive kind of pro-Likud media in the United States. It's also just the mainstream media that delights in Israel controversies. So Netanyahu knew that not only could he kind of gin up the right-wing pro-Likud media in the United States, which is pretty vast, but he also knew that if he needled Obama, he would create a week-long political story, and because the political reporters view Israel as a domestic political issue, not as a foreign policy issue. So in all those ways, the outside pressure, the congressional interest, the media interest, there's just a much greater spotlight on anything with a nexus to Israel than anything else. And inevitably, that weighs on the minds of politicians and policymakers. So you can't act like it doesn't.
So let me just ask you, like, maybe this is an obvious question. I'm just going to say, how often do you get requests or do you have meetings with representatives of like the pro-Palestinian side?
So I would be the one to take those meetings, and I actually did like a quite pretty regularly. I wouldn't say, but here's the thing. Usually with me in those types of meetings were either like peace groups, so sometimes Christian religious groups, Quakers and others advocating for peace. Sometimes they were kind of Arab American constituency groups, so less kind of Palestinian, but more broadly Arab American. So there wasn't like a significant, just Palestinian or Palestinian American kind of organized constituency that you would meet with. You meet with either pro-peace folks or the Arab American community. And look, frankly, I think that I end up taking those meetings because, like, I mean, not everybody wants to take those meetings, because you can get into trouble if you're seen as solicitous. I mean, I would get creamed in the right-wing press, right? I spoke at NIAC, the Iranian American group, right? Not on the Palestinian issue, but on obviously the Iran nuclear deal. And I still, you think I had dinner with the supreme leader of Iran, Peter, and so that there's a kind of chilling effect. You are expected, every senior U.S. government official is kind of, and national security is like almost expected to turn up at APAC. You're not expected to turn up at NIAC, and that's the common. I'll say one other, just to name something, Peter. I remember being in a meeting once early in the Obama years on Israel, and I again, the balancing act we always have to do. I think I'm just acknowledging something. I'm not suggesting there's anything kind of inherently wrong with it. It just is what it is. I remember looking around a room in the Situation Room on a meeting on an Israel-Palestine issue, and every single one of us in the meeting was Jewish, or of Jewish kind of origin, like me. I'm obviously not practicing. Which again, I don't want to sound conspiratorial. I'm not trying to advance a trope. I'm really not. Like, I think it's great that a lot of Jewish Americans go into foreign policy and national security. But I just remember thinking, what if everybody in this room was an Arab American? Like, you have a different, so let's not pretend like there's not some,
we all bring our own experience to these. We all express our experience,
We understand the Israeli fears and grievances and concerns intuitively as Jewish Americans, maybe not as much as Israelis. I don't want to claim that, but we have some understanding with it in a kind of our unconscious, literally, in a way that I intellectually I can try to understand the Palestinian experience, but I don't.
Yeah. So, talk to me a little bit about what these meetings, and again, I think I just also want to make it clear. I think neither you nor I believe there's some, vast, protocols of the Elders of Zion conspiracy, right? The American Jewish community is a community that's been around the United States for a long time. It's a well-organized community. It's a community that is politically articulate, and it's able to advocate well for the things that, as we would wish every community could be, but as you say, it has an impact on policy, and I would love to know a little bit about what these meetings are like. You're saying there are tons and tons of meetings with pro-Israel organizations, and like they come in. I presume they have kind of an agenda generally. Like what are those meetings are like, and what would you say are the effect? What do you then come away from those meetings? How do they affect policy, and maybe they don't?
I think part of what's interesting to me over time is that, over the years, I met so many times with the usual suspects, right? From the organized American Jewish community. And part of what you start to realize is this is a pretty small number of people. The American Jewish community is a large, sprawling, raucous, wonderful community. And it's kind of like 10 to 20 people that you find yourself meeting with all the time.
Right.
and some of whom were, by the way, are wonderful people. Some of whom less so. Um, and look, you know, what again?
Mhm.
It's not a conspiracy. It is what it is. People are advocating a position, but you know, it's a common position. Whatever the tension point between us and the Israeli government was at a given time, they were usually coming in to represent what I already knew to be the Israeli government's view in that circumstance. There was a big push at the beginning of the Obama administration after Netanyahu's election for the United States to recognize Israel kind of formally as a Jewish state, which actually had not been U.S. policy before 2009. There was a big push on us to pressure the Palestinians into talks, even though it wasn't clear that those talks were going to lead anywhere. Whenever there was an international incident like the Goldstone report or the Turkish flotilla, you have to, you know, make sure that you're doing everything you can at the UN to kind of block this from going forward. But I would also get kind of advice, you know, on how to talk about these issues. And I remember, you know, to give you an example, they'd complained that we dealt more with Palestinian grievances than Israeli grievances, which I did not think was the case, frankly. And one of these people said to me, "Well, yeah, you're right, Ben," because I'd showed him all the things we said about, you know, Israel's legitimate security concerns, for instance, and its history. And then he said, "But you know, you put the Palestinians second, so it suggests that you think they're more important. You flip the order." I mean, it would get very specific, you know, and language that Obama needs to use, reassurances that he needs to give. And then the nuclear deal was insane. I mean, the number of armchair centrifuge experts, you know, and that would get a little frustrating because, you know, we have nuclear scientists in the government, and I've got somebody from an organization like yelling at me about advanced centrifuge technology, and I'm like, I think Ernie Moniz understands this, you know. But you could tell that, again, it's not a conspiracy because other groups do the same thing on their issues, just not as effectively, frankly. But you could tell that somebody else had briefed them, you know, in most instances. And whether that was the Israeli government, their own staff, I'm not suggesting. I'm just saying that, like, you can tell when you're meeting with someone who's kind of there to press a case. And in this case, it was always whatever Netanyahu's priorities or differences with Obama at the moment were.
You mentioned just a minute ago that, you know, a lot of the people, sometimes you would find that a lot of people, you know, who worked on this issue were Jewish. I remember asking once, like when I was writing my book, of a former Obama administration official who was not Jewish. I said to her, like, what's it like when you're talking about these issues and there are no Jews in the room? And she's like, oh, that very rarely happens. You know, she's like, and I guess I just wondered if you feel like, you know, if you feel like it is different working on this issue, if you're Jewish or if you're not, and whether you feel at all like the folks who are not Jewish feel sometimes like they may need to take a step back, or they may not feel as comfortable dealing with it sometimes because, you know, it's, as you know, it's sensitive even if it's difficult even if you are Jewish, but it's that more challenging sometimes if you're not.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that there is a kind of a sense that, I mean, look, I'll give the obvious example, right? Like Congress. I would brief throughout the Iran process the Jewish Democrats in Congress. That was a group, you know, and Sandy Levin, wonderful man, like just phenomenal human being, would pull it together. And it wasn't subtle, you know, like I was going up every few weeks to brief every Jewish Democrat, which is a pretty sizable group, about the particularities of the Iran negotiations. And by the way, there was a Jewishness to it. Like we had bagels, you know, like, I mean, and so I think there's a kind of default to an assumption that you need like kind of to be informed by something of a Jewish perspective. But then even in that, I sensed, you know, I'm not a practicing Jew. I sensed at times a bit of a vibe of like, well, who are you to, you know, and I was called like a fake Jew. I like this kind of, you know, there were these narratives of Jewishness that kind of informed this stuff. But I think that, Peter, the interesting development, right, in the last 20 years is the Christian evangelical community's kind of complete embrace of the most right-wing brand of Israeli politics. It kind of actually shrunk the space in a way for the Jewish debate that usually happens around Israel, right? Because those people coming to see me knew they had a Republican Party that was just going to be in total lockstep, total hawks, total, wherever Netanyahu was. And so debates about Israel policy became entirely debates inside the Democratic Party instead of being, because there used to be pretty healthy Republican debates about this stuff. And so that weirdly, the kind of evangelical firewall, if you will, of support for Israel really empowered the more conservative, and I mean that in political sense, more right-wing Jewish perspectives in the American Jewish community, because they knew they had this cavalry behind them of the entire Republican Party. And so what was weird is, even though these were often debates with, Jews in the room, the presence that wasn't in the room was very powerful, which was the evangelical Christian movement, which gave them, again, like a kind of literally, to pardon the pun, a trump card. If the Democrats didn't, fall in the line around a certain position, they knew that the Republicans could bludgeon us with it. And that's the story of the whole Iran fight.
Right. Another thing that you've written about, I think you've talked about, I think is really important, and is the way in which sometimes race may play into this. And there may be certain assumptions about that it may be that much more challenging if you're Black, let's say, and I remember just myself once, at the shul we used to go to in Washington, someone making some passing comment about how, Susan Rice is the anti-Israel person in the administration. I was like, really? Like, has she ever done anything? And I was like, what? I mean, what is she? I almost like, I wish you, but it reminded me of something that you've said about some of the ways that you felt like Obama was perceived. And I wondered, working for a Black president, if you could talk about what you feel like if you feel like there are special challenges that face Black policymakers as they deal with this issue.
1,000,000%. And look, Obama said this to me, many times, that basically he was expected to somehow prove something that a white politician would not have to prove. And, and look, some of this is, he had, he was friends in the University of Chicago with Rashid Khalid, but he also came out of the Chicago Jewish community. He was a pretty conventional mainstream Democrat on Israel issues. And yet the expectation was he always had to go the extra mile. In the campaign, there were all these whisper campaigns about him. There were ads, shadowy ads, he's going to sell out Israel. He had to go to synagogues in a way that I think went beyond what a white politician had to do, because he'd have to go to the synagogue and kind of convince them that he understood Israel in a way that I don't think is the commonplace. And the phrase that we heard over and over and over again from kind of AIPAC types was, well, we have to know that he feels in his kishkas, right? And they thought
no one even uses the phrase kishkas except when they're talking about whether people love Israel enough. I'm so sick of that phrase. But anyway, go ahead.
No, exactly. But it was. They thought they were giving us kind of good advice, but it was borderline offensive, because it was like, 3 years in the administration, after he's done all these things for Israel, we're still being told that it's not clear that he feels it in the kishkas. And yeah, Susan had similar hurdles. And look, you couldn't escape the kind of awkward fact. What I came to realize is part of what was threatening was that Obama, as a Black man, lived in an oppressed community in this country, a marginalized community in the United States. And so therefore the assumption underlying that skepticism from the Jewish community is, well, then he's therefore clearly going to empathize with the Palestinians because they are treated in a marginalized way in Israel.
They're oppressed.
Because they're oppressed. So what was so awkward about it is that the thing that they were assuming, that by the way, might be true, right? They might be right. They might be onto something there. Obama understands the Palestinian experience in a way that a white person couldn't. Kind of exposes their vulnerability, right? And so this was a constant subtext, and then he also, I think, really would resent accusations of anti-Semitism that occasionally came his way, as if he doesn't understand prejudice, and so it was definitely complicated. And I guess the thing that kind of bugged me too was there was a kind of the example I give this is when I was planning the trip to Israel that Obama took. Michael Oren was the ambassador at the time. I've subsequently learned not a huge fan of mine, and he planned kind of the schedule with me. He'd come in, and we kind of go through where Obama was going to do while he was in Israel. We wanted it to be a resident trip that spoke to different pieces of Israeli society. So we're going to go to the Israel Museum for kind of the history, but we're going to do like an entrepreneurship thing to get at the Startup Nation stuff. And Oren was adamant that Obama visit like this Ethiopian Jewish community. And I kept saying, no, it's fine. Like we love the Ethiopian community there, but like it's kind of out of the way. And after time, it's like, why? There's like a tokenism to it that I was like, why would you want the Black president to go, take pictures with the Black Jews? It felt there's a tokenism that creeps into the way in which they try to address this issue. That also was at times present.
So you made a really, I think, really interesting, important point, which is the sense that like the reason that Black politicians might be particularly scary on this issue is because there's an assumption that they may, because of their own experience, identify with Palestinians who are oppressed, and that in that fear itself is a recognition that there is a problem, right? And it makes me wonder, in all of these meetings that you had with the Jewish representatives and the members of Congress, was there ever like a fourth wall moment where or was there ever a moment where you like got the sense that maybe some of these folks who were pushing you didn't always believe everything they were saying?
Yeah, I mean, two moments, right? One with the I'll start with Palestinian, and like we met with a group of Palestinian kids in Ramallah, and it was just I was the only staffer in the room. It was me and Obama and Michael Ratney, who was our CG in Jerusalem at the time. And every one of these Palestinian kids had an experience of the occupation that was just gut-wrenching to hear. I mean, I wish people would just sit in the room and listen to that for like an hour. It's impossible to walk out of that room and come out not thinking what is going on here. And the last kid sat there and he looked angry the whole time. And, just pissed, not at all flattered that Obama was even meeting with them. And when it got to him, he had a story. It was some horrible story, and I don't remember what the exact story was. Detentions, Israeli IDF soldiers like quartered in his home, couldn't take his exams because whatever the thing was. And then he looked at Obama and he said, "We are treated the same way in this country that the Black people used to be treated in your country." And he paused and he said, "Financed by your government, Mr. President." And it was just like the direct shot to the solar plexus,
Right.
And I remember Obama was just silent on the, so he got it, right? But in terms of like I would get it would come up a lot on Iran and on to some extent on Palestine. Because on Iran, I would go up to meet with members and I'd have members trying to talk to me about the PMD, right? This is a very specific issue, the investigation of the possible military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program at a certain facility, Parchin, where the work we assessed had ended. Not just we, the Bush administration assessed on weaponization of nuclear weapons had ended years and years ago. And I've got members of Congress talking to me about what the inspections regime needs to be at Parchin, like some of whom are expert, but some of whom, bless our, they don't know why, like what traces of isotopes you're looking for. I mean, the talking points would get so specific on Iran that you knew that this was, and you were talking about echo chambers, which is what got, obviously hung on me. This was such an echo chamber, because like every member you're meeting with just conspicuously happens to be obsessed with like the inspections regime at Parchin, and so something like that would happen where you would sense that obviously that everybody's working off of a set of points, and some people understood the points and some people didn't. They just got them before the meeting. And then on Palestinian issues, like, there was a deeper understanding because I think just the issues have been around for longer. But I do remember being in a couple of meetings where Obama was, in some dust up with Netanyahu. I remember being in a meeting, and I won't say what group or who it was with, but like, when Netanyahu had made some pretty racist comments at the end of his campaign. The Arabs are voting in droves. I think this was like 2016. Yeah. And Josh Earnest had been kind of critical at the podium. Right. And a member of Congress was complaining to me about this, and I'm like, what do you want us to do? Look, the guy is being a racist. He can't come out against the two-state solution now. He's talking about the Arabs voting in droves, and we're asked what we think about it. How can we not give an answer that that is somewhat honest? And he said, why can't you just blame the Palestinians? And I was like, for what? And he's like,
I'm voting in droves.
And he started talking about like incitement and but it was like the pivot was not subtle, and so stuff like that would happen, and it was a fourth wall moment, because most of the time actually it's not like that. It's like earnest, albeit often conservative views. And every now and then though something like that would happen where you're like, okay, we're actually having the discussion here. I mean, the last one I'll say here is on Iran. Like, the members would call me at the beginning of the August recess in 2015 when we're heading in the Iran fight and be like, AIPAC put out a press release saying they're going to spend $40 million like on ads, like, on this, like the money issue became acute, and people started to say, AIPAC told me they'd cancel my fundraisers if I vote this way. Like we're never supposed to name the issue of money. But like, when it became very acute and AIPAC spending money and threatening people that they're going to cancel fundraisers, suddenly you're having that conversation in a way that you weren't even allowed to kind of allude to it in normal circumstances.
Right. I mean, it's crazy because some of the same people who will easily, openly acknowledge that American politics is corrupt because of the way in which money influences everything also feel like, it's anti-Semitic to mention it in this context, right? I mean, if it's true in general, it's true for this, right?
That's the point. It's true for everything. The fossil fuel industry has been, pretty well successful. The gun industry has been pretty successful. It's not a Jewish specific thing. It just happens to be that I think the combination of money and passion, right, and organization, coupled with this evangelical piece that has emerged in the last several decades, that is not about Jews, right? Obviously, except the evangelicals who want to convert them to rapture. That's made this as one of the most powerful lobbying entities or collectives, but it's not unique. It's there's a lot of them up there.
Right. We don't have too much time, but I wanted to ask about the Biden administration. So from my perspective, it's been a little depressing the way they've been handling Israel-Palestine stuff. Not maybe surprising, but they've basically I think the ambassador nominee to be the head of the UN said that BDS is borderline, nearly verging on anti-Semitic. Of course, Biden has been very clear that there's no conditions under which they would condition military aid, regardless of what Israel does. There's this new statement now that basically they don't believe that the ICC, International Criminal Court, has jurisdiction. They've basically accepted this International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which, as I think you've talked about, I think could be interpreted as defining basically, any criticism of the idea of Jews. So I guess the question I want to ask you, without getting you in trouble, is these folks. I mean, and you like these folks. These are your friends. They're good people. I mean, they seem to me good people. How much, frankly, do you think they believe this stuff? Do you think these positions are what they genuinely believe, or like what is it? What's going on?
I think that on some of these issues, look, because I share your concern that this is a pretty unsettled collection of things that are being done to completely delegitimize criticism of Israel and the occupation at a time when de facto annexation is happening, and to kind of make BDS the new front, the new culture war issue on this stuff. And on the one hand, I think that if you were to present any one of these individual issues to most of the senior Biden people, they would, on that issue, understand, be able to intellectually occupy the position of, yes, Israel should not be singled out for criticism. Yes, BDS is bad and dangerous. And so there's a rationalization that happens issue by issue without stepping back and looking at kind of what is happening here. That's one point I'd make. The second point I'd make, though, is that on the Israeli government, come on, these guys were in with me. Netanyahu made our lives hell every day that he could. And every one of those people in the Biden administration know that, that we were treated with no respect, that Netanyahu undermined Obama, that he, made an agreement behind Obama's back to come address a joint session of Congress to try to blow up Obama's foreign policy, that he was completely disingenuous in his approach to the Palestinians for years. And it disappoints me that that history should matter, and because some of the positions they're taking depend upon the idea that the U.S. should stay out of things that should be dealt with through negotiations, right? So like I saw Tony Blinken, wonderful man, rooting for his success, but say that the U.S. was going to keep our embassy in Jerusalem, but we couldn't say whether we thought East Jerusalem would be part of a Palestinian state, would be a capital of a Palestinian state. Well, number one, there are no negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians happening now. So there's no reason that we can't address something because it has to be negotiated at this time. And secondly, John Kerry gave a speech saying that East Jerusalem would be the capital of a Palestinian state at the end of the Obama administration. So which leads me to the last point, which is that it feels like we're in the defensive crouch, the typical, that these issues are shaped and framed and defined from the right, that if you're a mainstream Democrat, not only are you expected to kind of take a set of positions, you're expected to apologize for the people to your left, right? And so instead of saying, you know what, I'm not going to tell some 19-year-old kid who, is getting politically engaged in college and is really upset by what he's learned about how Palestinians are treated.
Right. Who may be the cousin of that guy in the West Bank who went through that hellish experience, who you met with. So he might have some personal experience with it. Right.
Or he could even be Jewish. He could be a liberal Jew who and he joined some group that wants the university to divest from, whatever that's made in the settlements or something.
Right.
I'm not going to call that guy an anti-Semite just so that I can, have a talking point at AIPAC or in some congressional hearing. Like, that's not fair. And not only it's wrong, but it also allows this whole debate around Israel to be framed by Bibi Netanyahu and Mike Pompeo and Tom Cotton. Like, we should have our own positions. And so again, less any one issue, what is would be concerning over time is this defensive kind of crouch on, bleeds into how they approach the Iran negotiations and what they say about the Palestinians, and I think thus far with the campaign and to date, that they've definitely tacked in that direction at a time when the Democratic caucus in Congress is becoming more progressive. Other Democratic candidates were willing to be more vocal in their criticism of certain Israeli government policies. And it may be the case that they're thinking, well, it's the beginning of administration, we're trying to pass a COVID relief bill, we're trying to fight a pandemic. The last thing we need is any static on Israel. I totally get that mentality. At the same time, that's the same, there's always going to be a reason to have that mentality. it'll apply. I guarantee you, a year from now it'll apply because there's a midterm election, and then a year after that it'll apply because you're in for re-election. And so there's always a reason to just try to feel like it's just not worth the headache of deviating at all from a set of positions.
Right. So I know you have to go soon, but the last question I want to ask is, John Kerry gave a speech a few years ago now where he basically said, the two-state solution's got very little time left. I can't remember exactly how many, right? But we've passed whatever number of years he said we had left, it's passed now, right? So there are a lot of, I feel like the kind of elephant in the room sometimes in these conversations is kind of like whether this two-state paradigm really still bears any relationship to the reality on the ground. And you were kind enough to retweet, I'm sure it made you super popular, a piece that I wrote, suggesting that we actually need to think about what always struck me as frankly the most natural thing for progressive Americans to support, which was basically, a government where there was equality under the law for everybody, which is what we aspire to in the United States. And I'm just wondering, I guess I have two questions. First of all, do you sense that among people in Democratic foreign policy circles, like that there, over a few drinks, sotto voce, there is any actual openness to this conversation or actually talking about this conversation of like, what do we do if the two-state solution is no longer popular and we actually believe in liberal democratic values? And how far away do you think the Democratic Party is from that position, if you think it could ever get to that position?
So I think we're pretty far away in the sense that, Peter, like, even behind closed doors, there's a set of talking points about a two-state solution that are talking points. And what's really striking,
believe them?
Well, what's really interesting, because I was gonna say, what's striking to me about them is like they could have been written right after Oslo, right? Like they're so out of date, and I think people believe them. I really truly think that people believe them, like thoughtful people, and yet if you press on it, we had a presentation that we would give people with the maps, and showing basically how this was becoming impossible, a contiguous, viable Palestinian state. And people kind of digest that and not really know what to say then. Like they didn't know what was going to replace the talking points. And here's what's interesting to me, Peter, just to unpack this. I always wished, and maybe it's clarifying now, given the direction that Israeli politics has taken in the last few years, that the other side of this debate would just be honest, right? In other words, like, I always wish that the right, or whatever you want to call it, because I think it probably encompasses some Democrats, frankly, would just say, we don't believe there should be a Palestinian state. We believe in the concept of a greater Israel. We feel sorry for the Palestinians, but they're just going to have to deal with it, because step by step, ultimately, we believe that all this land should be Israel, and the Palestinians over time are going to have to just, move into Jordan, be absorbed into Lebanon, Jordan. Some of them can stay in the Jewish state. That's the position of the Israeli government. Frankly, that's the position of the Republican Party. Even if they don't,
they're more honest about it, right?
Yeah, they're more honest about it. They move the embassy, and I think that's the position of some conservative Democrats who don't say that, but I think that they know what's happening. And they've been playing this talking points around the two-state solution, and then blame the Palestinians for it never happening. I got so sick of hearing Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. It's like, well, when did we give them one? I mean, maybe Arafat had one at Camp David, and I know there are others. People will like throw a bunch of history at me, but like, I can tell you, we didn't really give one when I was there. Not a real one, or the Israelis did. So first point is, it has to be. There's not a broad consensus around a two-state solution. Like Bush said that when he wanted like Tony Blair's support for the Iraq War. Like the Republican Party and some of the Democratic Party, and certainly most of Israelis, believe that there should not be a two-state solution.
They're one-staters,
They're one-staters, and we don't act like that. We act like somehow Bibi Netanyahu believes in the two-state solution, and we pretended, to my shame, at times in the Obama administration, like he was interested in that, when I don't think he was ever. That's the first point. So what does it mean? I think that in the Democratic Party, there's still this kind of, in the foreign policy establishment, there's still this kind of theology of the two-state solution. That there's some formula at some point. Like John Kerry very much represents. John Kerry believes very deeply in the two-state solution, and he really believes that there's a formula. And I respect him for believing it. By the way, I'm not being negative. He believes there's formulas of international support and negotiation and step-by-step processes and assurances to Israel. And I think it's harder and harder to see that, and that at a minimum, the U.S. should, and I've long favored the U.S. just putting out our positions on final status issues long before Kerry did, because I think we needed to just lay down a marker. Like, here's what we think should be the case, just so there's a kind of a record of like, the goalposts have moved so much. So like, this is actually what we think would have been fair or could be fair if we ever could get back to it. And then I think that because the Biden administration is unlikely to do much in this space, unlikely to spend the next 4 years really trying to deal with this, because what's the point, from their perspective, that the Democratic Party's views are probably going to evolve from within the caucus, and the progressives are going to be, there's nowhere else for them to go intellectually probably than some kind of one state self-determination with democratic rights set of ideas. I myself don't even know where I have to, because what I thought were my radical position, right, of the U.S. taking positions, stating them publicly, and frankly being willing to pursue them at the United Nations, which was totally radical in the mid early 2010s, is now pretty much out of date. So I myself have to wrestle with this the next few years, because I still believe that it'd be the preferable to have two states, but I have to wrestle with the reality that it's hard to see how that's going to happen anytime soon, if ever.
Yeah. Well, Ben,
but I think the last thing I want to say, Peter, is that like the Palestinians are not going anywhere. There are millions of Palestinians, and I know that the other side of this debate can think, well, look, we're winning. It's working. And in many ways they're right, but at some point, whether there's not really many analogous populations in the world to the Palestinians like that. That's there, and something is going to continue to bring attention back to it. And so these debates, as much as people would like the facts on the ground to just make them go away, they're not going to go away.
Right, exactly. And even if Israel is winning, I mean, I spend a fair amount of time reading Torah and studying Talmud. I have not come across the verse that says that the foundation of Judaism is might makes right. Like that's not a foundational principle of either liberal democracy or Jewish tradition, as I see it. So it seems to me like.
I'll end on one note from my book. So this will be my little book preview.
Good. It's called After the Fall.
After the Fall. So and it looks at this rise of nationalism and authoritarianism around the world and how America was implicated in that. I was talking to a Hungarian of Jewish origin, like me. He's kind of like me. I think he's half Jewish, very much identified as a Jew, like for history. I mean, his family, obviously, a Holocaust history in Hungary. And we were talking about this phenomenon of Netanyahu being close to Viktor Orban, who is an anti-Semite, but who backs Israel's policies on the Palestinians and other things. And I was like, let me try to occupy Netanyahu's worldview, to show, maybe the view is Jews have been screwed throughout history by a corrupt, cruel world. And so, you know what? We just have to be corrupt and cruel ourselves. That's the only way to survive in this world. And if I got to make friends with a guy like Orban, I'm going to do it. And look, meanwhile, I'm delivering to the Jewish people. I've got, I've got the capital of Jerusalem recognized now in the United States. I'm pushing the Palestinians out, and it's working. And this guy said to me, without batting an eye, he said, Ben, a world in which ethno-nationalism is predominant is not a good world for the Jews. And ultimately, whatever short-term gains are won, are lost in the long term. And that's worth remembering.
Yeah. Ben, thank you so much for doing this. I really admire and appreciate the way you wrestle with this stuff. And I know it's challenging for someone like you who's been in government. So thank you. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks, Peter. Take care. I hear a
Yeah.
little voice by me, so
No
see you,
problem.
man.
Bye.
Bye. Hi. What's your